I am Jim Geraghty of National Review. Our special guest here is Senator Marco Rubio. We'll be doing a little kind of a interview chat conversation. There are note cards on your tables if you would like to submit a question. I reserve the right to ignore those questions. Please do, we notice we're not using the whole microphone format where people can come up and say, Senator Rubio, I have a question for you in the form of a long meandering statement. I realize this is our first segment of the day. Everyone might be a little tired from the wild, crazy partying last night. Both the Senator and I were occupied with the NFL draft last night. So we'll start with a nice, easy one, kind of get you going. We're very glad you have the water bottle there. The theme of our summit, of our conference, kind of the question in everyone's mind, is the future conservative, and if so, why?
Well, first of all, what is conservatism? And people describe it as a lot of different things, but I would say one of the key elements of conservatism is it applies time-tested principles to new challenges and new opportunities. And I think if we do that in the 21st century, we're going to have another American century. And our failure of current political leadership is the fact it's not doing that. The first thing is it's forgotten time-tested truths. What are some of those truths? Well, for example, you can't have a strong country without strong people. And you can't have strong people without strong values. You can't have strong values without the institutions that teach those values, which is the family, and the institutions that help family reinforce those values, which is our faith community, our voluntary organizations in society, etc. And so these efforts to replace the family, replace parenting, and replace our faith community with government laws and programs have been an abysmal failure because it ignores that fundamental truth. Another fundamental truth is that throughout most of the 20th century and continuing into the 21st, the direct price for a lack of American leadership on the global stage is chaos. And there are at least 5 different parts of the world today where you see that evidenced. What are the new challenges and the new opportunities that we want to apply conservatism to? Well, number one, in globalization. Globalization is real. It is here to stay. We are engaged in a massive, ongoing global competition. We are in the midst of a rapid and disruptive change in the nature of the economy. We are now competing with dozens of other countries around the world for investment, for innovation, and for talent. And only conservative principles will allow us to win. In essence, only a tax code that is limited and fair, only a regulatory code that is under control, only a national debt that is brought under control, only energy policies that favor the free market and American strength, only the repealing and replacing a health care law that punishes you for hiring people. Only doing those things will make us more globally competitive. Raising taxes and expanding government will not. The second point is we need to equip people with the skills they need for the 21st century. And that will require us to inject competition, innovation, and market choices into higher education, which today is largely an oligopoly controlled by accredited colleges and universities who really refuse to adjust to the times and have massively expanded the administrative wing of their operations at the expense of equipping our students with degrees that lead to jobs. So my fundamental short answer to the question is, if we can remember our time-tested truths, but also that limited government and free enterprise works better in the 21st century than it did even in the 20th, this new century is going to be better than the 20th century. There'll be more people, more prosperous. The American dream won't just survive. It'll reach more people than ever before. And the world won't be perfect, but it'll be better. It'll be more stable. And there'll be millions of people on this planet who can afford to buy the things that Americans make, invent, and the services that we offer.
Thank you for the short answer.
I used to be half that one before I was a senator.
There you go. One of the big stories this week, the Corker-Menendez bill. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about your poison pill. I'm sorry, your amendment. So if the Corker-Menendez proposal was just designed to give the Senate some leverage over this deal that President Obama seems quite determined to reach with Iran, if that bill goes down, what leverage does the Senate have?
Well, first of all, let me back up and say I don't want the bill to go down. It's not perfect. It's better than nothing. Mm-hmm. And it creates a process by which the Senate could review what the president does. That process, there is a process irrespective of the bill. In essence, if the president is going to use a national security waiver under the existing sanctions law, and what he's going to say is if I do a deal with Iran, I will use national security waiver, which the Congress gave me, to lift the sanctions. The Congress can always come back and pass a bill that says, no, you won't. And that's still there for us, irrespective. The only difference between that and what the Corker bill would do is the Corker bill would say, within 5 days of doing a deal, you have to submit to us the agreement. You have to give us 50 some odd days to review it. At the end of that period, Congress must definitively vote either to approve it or to disapprove it. Of course, the president could always veto that decision, and then we'd need 68, 67 votes to override it. So theoretically, that's a better process than the other one, simply because it forces the president to do certain things. But what are my poison pills that they call them? They're not. The first is it basically says, you don't do a deal with Iran unless Iran acknowledges that Israel has a right to exist. And why is that important? Because the criticism of that is, well, there are a bunch of countries in the Middle East that don't recognize Israel's right to exist, which is true. But none of them are trying to build a nuclear weapon. And none of them have billions of dollars of sanctions, which, if we lift those sanctions, we are turning over billions of dollars to the Iranian regime. And what will they use those billions of dollars for? To build hospitals? To build schools for children? No. They will use it to sponsor terrorism, groups like Hezbollah. And what is the purpose of Hezbollah? To destroy Israel. The other bill that I have, the other amendment that I have, is even harder to argue against in terms of just, politics, I suppose. Here's what it says. The president, when he signed that initial agreement, he put out a fact sheet, basically saying, here's what we agreed to. Unfortunately, the president's fact sheet and the Iranian fact sheet do not match up. So what I've said in my amendment is, whatever deal the president strikes has to mirror the fact sheet. In essence, yes, we are tying the president's hand with the president's plan, with what he told us the bill. I don't think the president's plan is a good one. I by no means endorse the plan outlined in the fact sheet. But the fact that they are saying that it is a poison pill to require the president to sign a deal that reflects what he says the deal is in and of itself incredibly worrisome.
Okay. Instead of needing the Senate to ratify it as being an official treaty, he really only needs 34 votes, right? He only needs 34 people to say, no, we don't like this senatorial review, we think it's fine. If the deal with Iran goes through, is that on Bob Corker?
I don't know if it's on Bob Corker. He's trying to figure out, in his role as chairman, the best way to give us the most leverage within the realm of that reality. Here's the reality. There are a lot of people in the Senate Democratic Caucus who will stand up and argue, we want a good deal with Iran, we want to support Israel, we don't want them to get a nuclear weapon. But ultimately, they are going to support virtually any deal the president signs. That is a fact. Unless it is just way over the top, virtually any deal the president signs, they are going to support, despite their public pronouncements. We've seen an erosion in that position over the last few weeks as well, and a number of senators who have been on the Democratic side that have been completely susceptible to pressure from the White House. And the argument the White House uses is, if you're not in favor of this deal, you are in favor of war. I would argue that a bad deal almost guarantees war, because Israel is not going to abide by any deal that they believe puts them and their existence in danger. And, they're not. And neither are the Sunni Arab countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, who have already been very clear, whatever Iran gets, we're going to get. And so, again, it's a complex issue, but it's an incredibly dangerous one at a critical moment that I think could determine what the next 50 years on this earth looks like in many ways.
You may have noticed there's been some talk about immigration at the summit. A couple weeks ago, Bob Schaefer asked you if you were president and you were offered a bill that looked like the Gang of Eight bill, and you said that's a hypothetical, it's never going to happen. Besides the fact that President Marco Rubio is a hypothetical, is there anything in the Gang of Eight bill that if you were president you would not sign into law? That knowing what you know now, you're like, nah, actually in retrospect we shouldn't have done that.
Well, first of all, Marco Rubio being president of the United States is a increasingly optimistic hypothetical,
right,
in my mind, anyway.
I have happy hypotheticals coming
So the question is there anything in the
Gang of Eight bill that you look at now and think, oh no, we shouldn't do that?
Well, first of all, what's changed? Let's go back for a moment. Before we went into that bill, one of the arguments that I made, including to the editors of National Review and to others, is I believed that if we didn't do something to preempt him, the president would sign an executive order granting amnesty to 6 or 7 million people after what he had done on DACA for minors. And that's exactly what's happened. And I do think that's a dynamic that has changed the entire equation for two reasons. Since that, the the Senate bill passed, we've had a migratory crisis on the southern border, which has further eroded public confidence in the institutions of government. And the second is the signature of that executive order, which has not just poisoned the debate, but increasingly put us in an incredibly precarious position because there is strong evidence, backed up by the fact that I've had leaders of the Northern Triangle in Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, tell me that DACA was used by trafficking groups in the Northern Triangle to recruit people to send their children here illegally. Those are major factors. And so I believe now that the only responsible way to move forward is to first and foremost secure our immigration system. If we do not do that, we won't have the political support to move forward. But beyond that, I think it'll be very difficult to achieve the other reforms that we want. I believe that if you move forward on a reform now, given those factors, without first putting in place security, you will have, in the interim, migratory crisis on the border that makes it even harder for us to achieve the other parts that need to be done, beginning with modernizing our legal immigration system. We have a legal immigration system in America that accepts 1 million people a year, legally. No other country in the world even comes close to that. And it is largely on the basis of whether or not you have a relative living here. And the argument that I use is that in the 21st century, it has to be based on merit and the ability to contribute economically. And there will still be people seeking asylum and refugee status, and there will be room for that. There will still be a family component to it. But ultimately, we are in a global competition for talent, and our legal immigration system should reflect it. I also think the reality is, and conservatism is also about reality, unlike the left that oftentimes lives in the theoretical or in the fantasy world. We have 12 to 13 million human beings living in this country illegally. There is not even the most vociferous opponent of the Senate bill filed an amendment to round up and deport 12 million people. No one in this room is asking for that. It's not a position that people are saying that we need to do. We do have to address that. And I believe there is a responsible way to address it. I believe we'll have the support of the American people to address it in a reasonable and responsible way. But I don't think we can do it until you first secure not just the border, but our employment verification system, and the fact that over 40% of the people in this country illegally entered legally. They didn't jump a fence. They came on a visa, and the visa expired, and they stayed. And we don't know who they are or where they are, because primarily when you come in on a visa, we log you in, but we never record when you leave. We're like a hotel that checks people in but never checks you out. It doesn't work. So that has to be dealt with as well. And that's why I think at this moment the time has passed for a bill of that type.
A moment ago you mentioned that the country takes in 1 million legal immigrants about each year. Should that number go down?
The number should be based on what our economic realities are and what they demand. There's no magic number, I would imagine, but by and large, I approach it from the argument that we want to continue to be the place in the world. We don't just want to be the leading investor in the world. We want to be the leading place in the world to invest. So if you have money to invest, no matter what country you live in, I want you to invest it in America. That's the first thing. The second thing is if you are the smartest person in the world in your field, or one of the smartest and most capable people in the world in your field, I want you to bring those skills to America. And we've always benefited from that as well. And I'll tell you why I want that. Because we do that in sports. If you are the best pitcher on the planet, you're going to play at Major League Baseball. If you're 7'2" and can dunk a basketball, you know we're going to bring you here. Why would we not do that for science, technology, and our economics? And so I think our system needs to reflect that. And so what the number is would be set every year on the basis of what our economic needs are. But by and large, I believe our country is enriched when we're able to attract the brightest people in the world that come here and people that want to invest money to come here. And I would further add that if you are the best physicist on the planet, I don't want you here on a temporary basis. I want you here as an American, not just living in America. I want you to be an American, and I want you here. And that's important too, because if you bring people here temporarily, they can never be Americans. To me, I don't just want people that want to live in America. I want people that want to become Americans. And part of that is through the permanent process that I've talked about.
I want to make sure I understand what you were describing earlier. I'm going to give you a happy hypothetical.
Okay.
President Rubio, in his first year,
sounds good already.
Right?
Yeah.
Passes serious border security, and everybody agrees the border is now secure.
Okay.
Passes a solid E-Verify, and every employer in the country is checking the citizenship of the people who come in to apply for a job.
Yes.
And an exit entry visa system that really works. People stop over checking into the hotel and not checking out. You get what you want. Everybody who's left over who are in the country illegally, what happens to them?
Well, there'd be step two in
Okay.
the interim. Step two is you have to modernize the legal immigration system, and you'll see why that's important in a moment. You have to have a legal immigration system that works, particularly on the permanent side, but also on the non-permanent side. You know, if there's shortages in farm labor, the ability, because let me tell you something, there are a lot of people in this country illegally who don't want to be here permanently. In essence, they want to work for 6 to 8 months, and then they want to go back to Honduras, and they'll come back next year to work in agriculture again. The reason why they don't leave is they don't want to have to sneak in again next year. That would help reduce a lot of illegal immigration as well. That's the second thing we'd have to do after the first thing. And then if we've done those two things, then I think a reasonable way to approach it is, if you are in this country for a decade or longer, have not otherwise violated our laws, you would have to come forward, undergo a criminal background check, obviously pass that. You would have to pay a fine for having broken our laws. You would have to start paying taxes. You would have to learn English. And in exchange for all of that, what you would get is the equivalent of a non-immigrant, non-permanent work visa to be in the U.S. And you would have to be in that status for a significant period of time. And at some point, if you choose, you could apply for permanent residency, but you'd have to do it through that modernized legal immigration system, and you'd have to do it just like everybody else, not a special process or anything of that nature.
Okay.
And in the interim, you'd have that work status if you choose. The past experiences show us, the '86 bill that passed during the Reagan years, a large percentage of people who received that amnesty at that time have never become citizens thereafter.
Okay. You mentioned violated our laws. Misdemeanors or just felonies?
Well, I would prefer to be as strict as possible in that regard, obviously.
DUIs?
Certainly, I think that's something that needs to be looked at. One of the problems I had in our debate about the Senate bill is it wasn't strong enough in regards to which criminal violations disqualified you. But basically, now, you know, at the end of the day, I would say that we need to be as strict as possible in regards to it. Because again, while I think we have to be reasonable about the fact that we have this problem that exists, we also have to understand that you don't have a right to illegally immigrate here. And one of the problems I have with the groups out there that are advocating for immigration reform, some of them, is they approach this debate with the argument that they have a right to be here. It's not a right. What you are appealing to is the best interest of the country. You are appealing to our morality as people, but you can't appeal to a right. There is no right to illegally immigrate anywhere in the world. And I think you clearly, if you don't have a right, you clearly forfeit it if that happens when you violate one of our laws, outside of the immigration realm.
Okay. Let's talk about taxes a bit. In the Rubio Lee tax plan, what's the top rate again?
35.
Okay. What's the top rate now?
39 and well,
Okay.
it's more than 39 if you add the Obamacare
Yeah.
and all the other stuff. But,
Okay.
and if you're in California, it's like 50 something.
Yeah. Well, that's why everyone's leaving. So and what income level does it kick in again?
75,000 for an individual, unmarried, with no children, and 150 for a couple, unmarried with no children.
Okay, I'm looking around the room for the gasps. All right, pretty good. I was going to say, because I thought the future was conservative. And for a bunch of folks, $75,000 doesn't seem like a ton of money, and that's the same.
Well, let's examine that for a moment.
Right.
So you're a single person with no children, you're making $75,000 a year, and theoretically you're at the 35% tax rate. But if you're putting money aside for retirement pre-tax, that lowers your tax basis, probably knocks you down into the 15% bracket. If you're putting money in a health savings account pre-tax, that is also knocked down your bracket. If you're making money through a pass-through, S corporation, which, while not all S corporations are small businesses, virtually all small businesses start as S corporations. We're lowering the tax bracket for income through S corporations to 25% from paying today at 39%, theoretically, depending on what bracket that you're in. And here's the other point I would make. What I've just outlined to you means that over 90% of Americans would see a significant reduction in their taxes. Any tax reform plan is theoretically, could be, if you had a flat rate of 25% on every American, a significant number of people would pay more in taxes. Primarily the people that today are paying 10 or 15 would be paying 25. So ultimately, the point of a tax plan is to find fairness in the system and make it simpler and easier to comply with, and our plan does that. The argument that some have used is, well, get rid of the child tax credit that you add, which would lower the top rate from 35 to 34, maybe 33.5. But here's the argument for the child tax break. It is more expensive today to raise children than ever before. In some instances, depending on where you live in this country, the child care alone could eat up the entire income of one of the two parents that are working. We are studies that are now showing that millennials, generation of people, I don't even know what's the right cutoff date for millennials.
1980,
Well, you know it.
1981,
Yeah, you know it. If you are, you know who you are. Millennials are going to have less children and later than ever before, and that also poses significant problems for our society, not to mention for our families and our country. So while I don't think our tax code should be about encouraging people to have more children and bigger families or get married, it should certainly not discourage it. And I do think we need to recognize that in the 21st century, it is much more expensive to raise children than it was just 30 years ago for a variety of different reasons, not the least of which is the fact that many parents have found that public education in their communities is not adequate, and they've decided to place their kids in a private setting or homeschool them or what have you. In essence, they still have to pay the school taxes, but they're not utilizing the system because it isn't meeting their needs.
We're all familiar with the marriage penalty, and you and Senator Lee talk about the parent tax penalty. Could you describe that? And what
Well, the parent is the idea that if you have two people making the exam, let's say you have two couples making the exact same amount of money, and they have the exact same investments, property, etc., exact lives. The only difference between the two couples is that one couple has 4 children and the other couple has none. The couple that has 4 children isn't just raising 4 human beings. They are. They're raising the future taxpayers of the United States. In essence, the very people who will fund Social Security and Medicare, which today is a pay-as-you-go system. So this idea that some people have that I've paid into Social Security and Medicare, my money that I've paid in is sitting in Al Gore's lockbox, and it's just not true. Today's benefits, my mother's Social Security benefits, her Medicare benefits, are being paid for by today's workers. So what happens if you have less workers in the future and more people taking out of the system? You have a catastrophe. So in and of itself, my argument is that those families are raising the future taxpayers of our country. They are investing in the future taxpayers of our country, not to mention our future Americans, our future leaders, etc. If they chose to invest that money in a machine, they would get a tax break. If they choose to invest it in a human being, whose future our country will depend on, the tax code doesn't recognize it. And so there's a penalty embedded in the fact that it doesn't recognize the extraordinary contribution that parents and families are making to the future of our country by having children and raising them in the 21st century.
I noticed your example of a family with 4 children is spoken like a man with 4 children.
Yes.
I'll do a couple of the submissions from the audience, and then I have a couple lighter, more fun ones to close with. First of all, I don't know if this is necessarily you want to take this as a yes or no question, but is there any chance that Iran won't cheat on the deal?
No, Iran is they're going to violate, what Iran is going to do. I mean, I can elaborate, it's important.
If you like,
okay,
yeah.
Good. It's the ideas forum, right?
Yeah.
Here's the truth. Iran is going to exploit any loophole in the deal they can find. But ultimately, here's Iran's play. Let's get the sanctions lifted. We don't need a nuclear weapon today anyway, is their argument. But let's get the sanctions lifted. Let's retain everything we've gained up to this point. We'll get the sanctions lifted. We'll increase our asymmetric capabilities. In essence, we'll have stronger proxy groups around the world that can attack America and the West and our enemies. We can improve our military capabilities, particularly those of the Quds Force. We can stabilize our situation politically, internally. And the West has a very short attention span, right? They focus on something for a few weeks and then they move on to something else. At some point in a couple years, 5 years, 6 years, 8 years, whenever it may be, a stronger Iran can then reemerge and say, you know what, guys? We believe that our enemies have nuclear weapons too, so we believe we need to build one. And the world will then, and Iran's theory is, the Europeans at that point, they're not going to reimpose sanctions. All those German companies that are going to be doing business in Iran, all those French companies, they're going to be just all over those governments to say, hey, don't mess up our business deals we have going on. And America's not going to reimpose sanctions. You know why? Because we'll blow a bomb off in one of their cities. We'll attack them. We'll blow up their embassies in Latin America. We'll kill Americans. We are going to punish them. A stronger Iran. And even if they strike us militarily, we've now spent 8 to 10 years hardening our facilities. So even their capabilities, short of a nuclear strike, will not be able to get to our system either. And that's what they're banking on. And this is the best way to describe Iran is it is a nation its people don't necessarily reflect this, but its leaders are radical Shia clerics who believe that it is morally acceptable to lie, to accept the benefits of global international laws and organizations. They accept their seat at the UN, but they don't accept its legitimacy. So they'll accept the benefits of any deal, but they don't necessarily feel bound by its restrictions. And they have no moral objection to lying. In fact, they have lied throughout this process. They have always had a secret component to their program. I could go on and on, but one more point I would make, this whole verification stuff is complicated as well. Because we're going to find a facility and we're going to say, we want to inspect that facility. And they're going to say, no way. And we're going to say, yes, but we need to. It's the deal. And they're going to say, no way. And 90 days later, they're going to say, okay, fine, whatever. You want to look at it, go ahead. You're not going to find anything. Because they cleaned it up. And then we're going to go back a year. In this cat and mouse game that Saddam Hussein played and others played, we're going to find ourselves in that same cycle with Iran.
It would be as productive as looking for what's in Hillary's servers.
Right. A little less dangerous, I guess. The servers, I mean.
A pretty quick question. So as president, how would you choose Supreme Court justices, and which one of them do you admire?
Well, obviously, I'm a huge admirer of Scalia. I think he's an extraordinary mind. And I think the role of a Supreme Court justice has always been to interpret and apply the Constitution, not to try to redefine it to meet contemporary needs of society. My biggest problem with the judiciary is it has become almost a super legislative branch, both in the lower courts and in the Supreme Court. This notion that has actually filtered into society that the job of the Supreme Court is to protect us from the people that we can elect or unelect by imposing their judgment above that of the political branches. And I want judges that clearly reflect that view.
Okay. I see a question here that says, are you also paleo? I don't know if they mean paleo-conservative
I think
or
diet.
paleo-diet.
I think they're talking about Governor Bush's diet. No, I'm not. I ate a key lime pie yesterday. Not the whole pie. But that was my fruit, lime, right? So,
there you go. What can be done to improve the primary debates? Can we get rid of the cattle call format? I'll preface this. Obviously, having National Review host them makes them a lot better.
Sure.
But beyond that,
Well, first, I think it comes down to the quality of candidates. And, we have as a Republican, I feel like we're blessed to have a number of very talented, credible people running for president. And I always tell people, don't view that as a negative. I think from this field, you're going to get a president, a vice president, some cabinet officials, and even a future president. The Democrats are struggling to come up with one candidate. So we're blessed to have a field of that magnitude. The process is what it is. Is it going to be hard to carry out a debate with 20 people on a stage? Yeah, I suppose. It's going to be difficult at the beginning. But ultimately, I do think that we should take comfort in the notion that we have high-quality people running for office and that competition always breeds excellence. I really believe that when you're in a competitive environment, it makes you better. And I think our nominee, whoever it is, although I have a preference, our nominee is going to be a better nominee and ultimately a better president because they have gone through a competitive primary process in which they'll have to debate other quality, intelligent people.
Is there any format of debate that you really like or really don't like? Or, I know Fred Thompson used to say, they were asked to do a show of hands, and he put his foot down and said, no hand shows. I'm not doing that today.
Yeah, I don't like the gimmicks.
Yes.
I mean, I think part of the problem the last time is it demeans the office that you run for of the debate. This is serious stuff we're talking about, right? This is not The Apprentice or Survivor. I mean, this is serious.
Well, there may be Donald Trump.
Well, fine, but it won't be Apprentice or Survivor. It'll be a serious debate about the future of our country and at a time that is so critical because, I hearken back. Think about the early 19th century, right? America was an undeveloped country still, relatively young, incredibly young actually, and they made a decision. They chose to embrace industrialization, and it was disruptive. I mean, it took people out of farms and put them into factories. It moved people from rural areas to urban areas. It created all kinds of problems: traffic, housing, labor, health issues, environmental. But what happened because we embraced industrialization? In less than 100 years, we became the most powerful and prosperous economy in human history. And we built the capacity that allowed us to save the world from evil, not once, but twice in the last century. I believe we're at a moment like that now. The only difference is we are entering it as a developed country now. But we are being asked to adjust to the realities of a post-industrial era. Embedded within it is extraordinary promise. But if we choose wrong, we're going to be left behind by history. We'll still be an important country, but a stagnant one. And we will leave a whole generation of Americans behind. And I hope the debate, its formats, and its content will reflect the seriousness of the moment which we're living in.
Okay. Going back to immigration for a moment, many Americans worry that immigrants are not being sufficiently assimilated, and yet assimilation is never discussed in immigration policy. What would you do as president to return to an assimilationist policy?
Well, I would say twofold, a couple things about that. There are certainly differences between immigration today and 100 years ago because of the ability to travel back, the ability to, those are just realities, and it's changed. I mean, I live in a community of immigrants, so there are people in my community that are more tied to their native country than to the U.S., and that's just a fact of life. But I also think we shouldn't underestimate how many immigrants truly want to become Americans. If you go to a naturalization ceremony, I went to one about 4 or 5 years ago. It was an extraordinary, 1,500, 2,000 people at the Miami Beach Convention Center. And it was, I never saw so much patriotism in one room. These were people that were Americans by choice, who wanted to be Americans, who were proud to be Americans. It was extraordinarily uplifting. And that happens too. And certainly by the first generation, you've seen it dramatically change the way people live. How we can improve assimilation, ultimately, I think we have a challenge in this country assimilating people that are born and raised here too. We have textbooks in our public schools that teach people that America isn't special. And I think that's a big problem. One, because it's not historically accurate. Almost every other society in human history has told people that your future is determined by your past. America's been different, and that alone sets us apart. But here's the practical problem with that. And I think this is true for immigrants and those born here as well. If people don't believe your country's special, they won't sacrifice for it. People don't sacrifice for the ordinary. They don't sacrifice for the regular. The reason why people are willing to fight for America, sacrifice for America, make tough decisions to preserve and improve America is because they believe it is unique and set apart and different from other countries. And we can lose that if we don't instill that in our children and in our families.
One more serious one, and then one light one. 10,000 U.S. citizens each day reach age 62 and are eligible for Social Security and Medicare, and they're going to live to be about 80 to 90 years old. How do we handle this?
And we've talked about that going all the way back to my Senate campaign in Florida, where everybody thought, well, you're talking about Social Security and Medicare changes, you're dead. I mean, it's Florida. People get it, they understand. I always start with the same premise. My mother's on Social Security and Medicare. I assure you I would never be for anything that would be bad for my mother. And I think that the longer that we wait to deal with this, the likelier it will be that my generation, and even my mother's generation, will see dramatic, disruptive changes in a negative way to Social Security and Medicare. I want to save those programs. The math is very simple. Those programs take in less money than they pay out. It dramatically accelerates over the next 8 to 10 years, and the functional impact is we'll bankrupt the country and ultimately bankrupt the program, ultimately bankrupt society. And so my answer is the following. First of all, if we act now, we can make changes to those programs that preserve them without impacting people that are on them today or on the verge of retirement. What it will require is for my generation, people like me, I'll be 44 this month, to accept that our Social Security and Medicare is going to look different than our parents. It's still going to be the best thing in the world, but it's going to look different. Look different? We may have to retire at 68 and a half instead of at 68. Quite frankly, I intend to work as long as I possibly can, and because I want to, necessarily, not because I necessarily may have to. Beyond it, I would argue that we're going to have to change the way we index the benefit. It can't continue to grow at the current indexing that it has today. On the Medicare side, I think many of Paul Ryan's ideas are exactly on point, particularly the notion that for my generation, you should have the real option of taking your Medicare benefit that is risk-adjusted and capitated and use it to purchase a private plan in the marketplace that meets your needs better than traditional Medicare does. And my problem is the longer we wait to do this, the more disruptive these changes are going to be. And I'll leave you with this thought. Anyone in any party who is in favor of leaving Medicare and Social Security the way it is now is in favor of bankrupting it. And we have one more entitlement issue I want to raise. In 2016, our disability insurance program goes bankrupt. Basically, it'll only be able to pay out about 85% of what people are entitled to under the law. That is a new entitlement crisis that has not been talked about enough. But our disability insurance program is of a cataclysmic problem, and that's literally a year and a half away.
Okay. I would just remind you that if you really do intend to plan to work past 68, you'd be an ex-president in 54 or 55. So
I can go into the NFL, which is what I wanted to do anyway.
Think about alternative career. Well, you anticipated my final question.
Oh, final question.
Last night, the Miami Dolphins selected Louisville wide receiver Devontae Parker.
Yes.
Good pick, bad
yeah,
pick?
I wanted him or Todd Gurley of Georgia, and he was gone. So very happy with that pick.
Okay, actually,
we'll see what happens.
The correct answer was no, because Darrelle Revis is going to cover him twice a year for the Jets. So.
Well, we have other good players you'll have to cover too. So.
Senator Rubio, thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you very much.